My name's Josh. I'm a co-host on The Imperfects, the son of Sri Lankan and English immigrants, and I grew up on and am now raising my children on Wurundjeri country. I'd like to recognise the traditional peoples of this continent whose land was stolen nearly 250 years ago. In particular, we at The Imperfects would like to acknowledge the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation as the traditional owners of the land on which this podcast was recorded, and we extend our respect to all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples. I'm inspired by the strength and endurance of the world's oldest living culture, and we at The Imperfects pay homage to the traditions of story when we share stories on our podcast.
Quick! Is anyone here a doctor? Yes, her name is Dr Emily, and she's a psychologist. Please welcome to The Imperfects, our very own psychologist!
Ryan, you're pointing at me like you want me to start.
Well, because we never talk about who's going to start. There's no, because we don't have like a designated starter.
I always, every single time we play an introduction, to, no matter what format it is, I assume you're going to start. But in my head, I always think about something just in case you don't.
Oh, okay. Here we go. This is your chance.
Just then, I thought Ryan's got this. I won't think of anything. And then on cue, you just gestured for me to start speaking. Well, it is a Dr Emisode.
I definitely don't cut all that out.
Real thrill for the listeners to hear that. It's a Dr Emisode. She's back. She is fast becoming everyone's favourite format. Well, not you. Does that make sense?
I think, I know what you mean. You're worried about calling Em a format.
Yeah, she's fast becoming everyone's psychologist. We'll put it that way.
Well, not technically.
No, she's technically not there.
No, she's not there.
Absolutely
not at all.
Yeah,
that is not what she is. No. Nor is she our psychologist.
No.
She is a psychologist who we chat to every 4 weeks, and we learn so much from.
We should actually bridge mark this down as something to enter into the podcast awards. Just to go.
Oh yeah,
the intro. I think would be be a good thing to use as a.
I wonder if there's an award for the best intros.
I wonder if we'd be in the running. Best tone setter. Well, we'd win that. Definitely, it's an accurate setting of the tone.
It is. Well, if there was an award for best psychologist, we would win that.
Oh,
we wouldn't have.
We have Doctor. No, we wouldn't win it. Yeah, our psychologist would.
Dr M would. Yeah.
She's back again. She listens to. Can I hear sirens? Can anyone hear sirens?
That's me. Okay. At this end.
Some shit's going down in Perth.
Big time.
I was in Perth a couple of weeks ago, and one thing I didn't notice was people. There's just no one anywhere. Is that it?
Oh, really? It's very quiet. Is that true?
Yeah, it's comparatively to Melbourne and Sydney. Yep, it's more spread out from my experience. I think. Yeah, it's kind of
There's that huge stretch of grass down at the Swan River. Is it the Swan River the grass is? And I thought, I'll go for a run down there, but it is going to be packed. And there was no one. There was no one there. I don't know what was.
Yep.
Anyway, again, not exactly award-winning stuff. But,
God, we are knocking out. Geez, this is our best of at the end of the year is going to be basically this episode. Let's sort of replay this.
Well, Em, how are you, first of all?
I'm very good. Thanks.
Nice
I'm great. Thank you. It's good to be here.
Dr. M, every week or every time you come on the show, you've listened to a past episode of ours, of The Imperfects with one of our guests, potentially, and then you use that as fuel to fire the topic you want to tackle. And expand on. So is there an episode that you listen to that you want to talk more about?
Yeah, so it's actually going right back to the beginning of this season and listening to Kate Langbrook's episode, but particularly in reference to the outro when you were talking about, Hugh, when you were talking about love. And perhaps we might, Josh, if you're ready, we could play that excerpt and then I'll tell you why I wanted to talk about that in particular.
Every single time you experience the emotion of love, you are strengthening your vagus nerve. The vagus nerve runs from your brain to all the vital organs in the body and into your stomach. And the vagus nerve is so important because it regulates your body. When you're really stressed, when something really stressful happens, it's your vagus nerve's job to regulate that stress and get you back to an equilibrium where you were before. And the way and that is being resilient, like that's bouncing back very quickly from a stressful situation. the way we strengthen vagal tone is to experience love. The more love we have in our life, the more likely we are to respond well to challenging situations.
So I think what was said in there was really important. And what I'd perhaps like to examine in this episode is actually the barriers to those experiences of love. And that specifically being a sensitivity to rejection or fears of rejection.
Yeah. Wow.
Yeah,
awesome.
great.
That'd be great.
And when you say love, do you mean like being like feeling love from someone else, or just that kind of the mutual love between one other person? Like, is there a...
So it can be both, but I suppose, in reference to those micro moments of positive resonance, it's that ability for us to be really open to connection and to feeling like that possibility of being present with someone else and not fearing rejection.
Right. Because the first thing that happens in my mind, I go straight to thinking about romantic relationships and
Classic Hugh.
as in, because we're talking about, an example might be there as in like someone meeting someone but then not being totally open to it purely through the fear of rejection. Or like you'll hear people say, oh, they've got commitment issues, and that could be through a fear of rejection. Or is it, and then we're looking at the opposite of just someone saying, well, I'm open to this to see where it might take me because I'm open to the possibility of love, experiencing love. Is that kind of what we're talking about?
Yeah. Yeah. And also having a look at then, so there are a group of people or people that have a tendency to be really sensitive to rejection. And so I thought it might be useful to kind of explore what that dynamic is like, and then have a look at, well, how can we work with that in a different way?
Yeah. Because you've done a lot of work on rejection, haven't you?
Yeah, yes.
No, sorry, as in like...
Personally and professionally.
I've inadvertently experienced a lot of rejection,
But as in like professionally, that's something that you have done a lot of work on, isn't it? Yeah.
Yeah. So quite a long time ago, I did my PhD thesis on rejection sensitivity and kind of exploring what that dynamic looks like and what it's associated with in terms of like interpersonal and intrapersonal outcomes. So I can certainly talk a little bit more about that, but I feel as though, rejection is something that we all get exposed to at some point in our lives. And so I thought this could be kind of a useful thing to explore in terms of how to work with those experiences that we will inevitably have, if that makes sense.
Yeah. As an actor, I can't really relate, but I can imagine that rejection would play a part in some people's life. Yeah.
Yeah.
Great.
So I thought I might even just start with just defining what it is, because we can have a broad conception of what it means. The thing that I want to be really clear about when we talk about rejection sensitivity is that it's not a clinical diagnosis. So it's not a disorder. It's not something that you meet criteria for. And so I really want to kind of emphasize that this is more like a tendency or a disposition. So it's that disposition to anxiously expect, to readily perceive rejection, and to overreact to it. So there's kind of three components to that experience. So people that are more sensitive in their interactions with close friends and family, and we can get more into the specifics of that they will often go into those situations anxiously expecting to be rejected. So we actually kind of go into those interactions with the expectation that it is quite possible I'll be rejected. So there's not only the anxious expectation, there's also then what brings with that is that we have this tendency to readily perceive rejection cues in neutral behaviour.
So does that mean when you're interacting with someone, you're looking out for proof that you're being rejected, or they're deciding that they're not? Right.
It's almost like there's a bit of like confirmation bias, or like, I guess.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yep. And there's what's called attention bias. So for a group of people that might be higher in this tendency, when we go into a social interaction expecting rejection, it moves us and shifts us into that kind of state of defense or that state of fight or flight. And in that state of fight or flight, we become hyper alert to signs of rejection. But what tends to happen is that for people that are anxiously expecting rejection is that they start to see cues of rejection, for example, in the face or in the body language of people that actually are really neutral.
Right.
But the problem is that when you perceive rejection in someone's neutral behaviour, you actually then change your behaviour.
I'm just to jump in here. I'm just trying to picture scenarios. So this could be on a date, this could be in a job interview, this could be meeting a new group of friends, being introduced to new. Is this what we're talking about?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah,
okay.
absolutely.
It could even be like, I mean, the things that are coming out for me is like pitching ideas. Like if you're bringing an idea to a group, even like to people that you trust, if you've got any self-doubt or any like past trauma of being rejected in other environments, in similar environments, it's like I know that I often, if I'm pitching any sort of idea, I can, if I'm not 100% confident with it, I will be exactly like you say, Em. The first thing you're looking for is signs that you're right in that you're going to be rejected or they're not going to like the idea. And so then when you start seeing those little signs of like in the face of like, oh no, I knew this wasn't good. I knew they wouldn't like it. Your confidence drops. And you almost start, well, speaking for myself, almost start like backing away from the idea that you're pitching as you're pitching it. So it's like you're pitching this idea that you came in thinking this is going to be great. Can't wait to tell everyone. But as soon as you see a sign of doubt or what you perceive as doubt, I guess, in the other person, during the pitch, you're backing away from the thing that you're pitching, like pulling the ripcord, like, no, get me out of here. I'm about to be rejected.
Yeah, that's spot on. That is spot on. And what happens then is that in terms of kind of like that internal response, so we get this change in our physiology. We've kind of moved into this fight or flight response. We're hyper alert to facial expressions. And then, so we then feel rejected. In those moments, it's actually like I am being rejected based upon what I'm seeing or hearing from other people. So we then feel a number of things. And the main kind of responses that we might feel are twofold, is anger, so that very defensive response, or hurt and shame.
Yeah.
So then that feeling then changes or prompts behaviour. And it's then your subsequent behaviour that ultimately, often particularly in romantic relationships, will actually result in real objective rejection from the other person.
Yeah, that makes sense.
I want to read your PhD. This is ticking. This is ringing so many bells in my head. Can I actually read your PhD?
It's actually very boring, but
I doubt that.
But these are like little small snippets.
Okay.
So to give you an example, if we use dating, because I think dating can be like a really fascinating and really relevant topic for lots of people. And I have to say, when I did my PhD, online dating was not a thing. So I unfortunately don't have any data about that, and I suspect a lot of this has changed. But it might be things like,
when you pick up your date in a penny farthing, you... Yeah, it has changed a bit.
Exactly. Yeah. So let's just say you might have maybe you're on a date with someone and you perceive that their differences of opinion about a particular topic feels to you really rejecting. So rather than it being about that you've just got a difference in opinion, that feels to you suddenly as though I am no longer worthy and I'm being rejected in this moment. And so that for someone might prompt them to become really quiet, to become really withdrawn, to change their facial expressions, their body language. And so then if you imagine sitting across from someone that's gone really quiet, that is not kind of engaging with you in the same way, that for the other person actually feels really disconnecting. And that it's actually that behaviour that then might prompt the other person to say, you know what, I actually don't think we're a good fit.
Or could it could that, because who knows what the other person's thinking? They've no doubt got their own self-doubt and insecurities. Maybe they then start thinking, they're losing interest in me. Like they start to blame themselves when it's nothing to do with them. Yeah.
Exactly.
I once went on a date a very long time ago, to be very clear. It wasn't the other day. And
post penny farthings though.
Pre post penny farthing, pre penny.
Excellent.
Which is actually, there's actually a lot of time between that, really. It's like hundreds of years. But
yeah.
We went on a date and the guy came out to take drink orders and she said, I don't think I'll have a drink. And I went, are you going to have anything? And she went, maybe just a tea.
Just the bill, thanks.
And I straight away took that as rejection straight away. And then I spent the rest of the time pretending I didn't really think it was a date, or I wasn't even that interested myself. But it was the second I felt rejected, so I was like, no, I don't want to be rejected. I'll do the rejecting, or not even do the rejecting. I'm not going to let myself get any further invested in this emotionally because she's clearly not interested because she won't even have a drink. No, that's right. She ordered dessert. She ordered dessert.
Straight into dessert. I'd take that badly.
She ordered a cheesecake. She said, do you have any desserts? I said, cheesecake. She said, yep, that'll do me. So I thought, she's not interested. So I didn't want to try. Like I didn't want to try at all because I didn't want to invest emotionally any further. And it was just, it's funny. I'd always thought it was a funny story about how she ordered a cheesecake, so she wasn't interested. But just hearing you speak then, I'm like, I perceived rejection, and then so I acted like I'd been rejected, which would have been very not overly attractive to her.
Well, it's just interesting being able to observe that kind of dynamic. And so, yeah, absolutely, there could be lots of different things that we're all doing. And this is the thing, is that it feels so aversive, in that moment to perceive an experience of rejection, like I am not worthy in some way, or there's something about me that's not lovable in that moment. That feels really painful. So then we have these kind of defensive systems come online that help us kind of manage with that pain. And one of those things might be avoidance and withdrawal, because it really helps you move away from that feeling of rejection, or I'll reject you before you reject me.
Yeah. Yeah.
So in that situation, like in dating particularly, I mean, I guess it works for a job interview as well. Or, I mean, I don't know. Do people even do job interviews in person anymore? I feel like it's probably, I heard someone say the other day that they were doing a job interview and it was on, they would like, this is actually, don't worry about it. It's got nothing to do with what we're talking about. I saw your facial expressions, and I felt the rejection. I was like, nah, pull the ripcord. It actually doesn't have anything to do. I could almost visualize myself in the edit deleting it. So just,
I don't think it was just you couldn't even see Josh and I, but I think we were doing the same look as him.
Yeah. I was like, where is
I didn't even notice what look I was doing.
No. So when in this situation, whether it be like a job interview or a date, and you start to, I don't know if you could even, I guess if you've listened to this episode and you become aware of it, as anyone who's listening right now is, if you were to go on a date tonight, for example, and you carry into it these same sorts of like feelings of doubt or rejection sensitivity, when you start to perceive the other person losing interest, or you start to perceive rejection, what do we do?
So that's a big question.
A good question?
So there are a big and a good question.
Okay. Mark it down.
I mean, so there are lots of things that we can look at. And I guess it's not even just specific to, obviously, just to dating. It's going to be a kind of across the board about how I approach situations where it feels like there's a risk in some way to me being accepted, or me being loved, I suppose. And it may not surprise you that the first thing I will talk about is awareness that this is something that's happening for me. But it might even be useful to actually kind of have a look at, well, where are the origins for this kind of sensitivity? And again, this is probably not surprising, but that people that are prone to being more sensitive to rejection are also more likely to have had rejecting experiences in childhood or abusive experiences in childhood too. So they come to build up an expectation that primary caregivers, the important people in our lives, are possibly going to reject us, rather than having this kind of implicit knowledge that my primary caregivers are accepting and predictable and loving. So having kind of an awareness of where is this sensitivity showing up from, I think can be helpful. And having a look at, what was this like for me when I was little? And in fact, some of that behavior in response to like abusive or even kind of neglectful experiences in childhood is a really adaptive response. I'll give you an example. There was some research done by Dr. Seth Pollack, who's at the University of Wisconsin, I think it was in 2000, so it was a little while ago. But he was looking at responses to facial expressions in children, and he compared a group of 8-year-olds. So we had a normal sample, or a sample of kids that hadn't experienced any abuse, and then we had a sample of kids that had come from an abusive background. And so he presented pictures of different facial expressions moving from a face that is kind of sad into kind of progressively angry, hostile and aggressive facial expressions. And so these were kids looking at photos of adults with different facial expressions. And what he found was that the kids that had come from an abusive background were so hyper alert that they would pick up the most early signs of anger in a facial expression so much significantly more so than the kids that had not come from that abusive background. And if we think about the function of that, it was so important and vital for those kids to be able to pick up on the really early signs of anger and aggression and rejection from a parent, because that would allow them space and time to be able to look after themselves, to hide, to defend themselves. Does that kind of resonate?
Yeah, of course.
Well, that process, what it does is actually starts to sensitize the amygdala, which is that threat center. So the amygdala becomes much more sensitive to our environment and to picking up on those cues of potential anger or rejection. And then when you move into adulthood, the biggest trigger for those early childhood kind of models of the world are our adult romantic relationships. It's like they just get really triggered as soon as we enter into that space.
Wow.
Wow. Yeah. And so you continue that sensitivity as well in your perceiving of facial expressions and behavior to protect yourself. So as soon as you get into a relationship and you're required to be somewhat vulnerable, do you run away from that? Because it would be, it's sort of undermining the defense system, so to speak. Yeah, absolutely. And for people, it's interesting too, because there will be a group of people that in response to the perceptions of rejection, they will withdraw or they'll become submissive. But there is also a group of people who are really sensitive to rejection who will actually move to aggression and hostility and controlling and jealous behaviours. So this is also where we can see kind of the impact of, for example, domestic violence. If we look at the perpetrator, kind of actually looking at, this experience of perceived rejection is so wounding that it prompts very quickly an anger and an aggressive response. To really, like, the effort that people are making there is to avoid this sense of feeling unworthy, unlovable. Does that really resonate?
Yeah.
Does the chances of you reacting in an aggressive way as opposed to a withdrawal way, because they're kind of almost the opposites on the spectrum, is that something that is sort of down to your genetics, like who you are underneath it all, or is that influenced by other sort of childhood factors?
I think it can be a very big combination of things, like as kind of we've spoken about before, that there's never just one
of
reason as to why you might be more inclined to respond with aggression. Certainly modelling is a big one. So, having had an abusive parent, there does tend to be this kind of modelling of that behaviour, even though as a child you never wanted to be like that person.
Yeah.
But there are gender differences, and that has been relatively well documented, that, particularly in the rejection sensitivity work, is that males are potentially more inclined to move towards the jealous, controlling anger responses, and that females can move towards the withdrawing, submissive, kind of internalizing symptoms response.
It sounds incredibly, to use one of your great words, adaptive, because it feels like that's almost an evolutionary thing where women to protect themselves would withdraw to avoid the confrontation, whereas men would lean into the confrontation because it's where they have an upper hand. Physical confrontation, I mean.
Yeah.
Yeah. Wow.
And
that's fascinating.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. So I guess then the question is like, well, what do we do with all of that?
Yeah.
Because I'm thinking about all this if we move away from relationships and think about like a job interview professionally, people must experience this all the time when the job interviews are such a difficult thing to do. And I can imagine if someone's sitting there trying to go through a job interview they really desperately want, and there's 3 people in the room and maybe one of them has just, the way they sit their body language is not overly positive, and they're starting to interpret, no, that person doesn't like me, or I've said something wrong here. It's very hard to then get your interview back on track, I reckon. I think a lot of people would struggle to wrestle that back to, no, I feel like I've answered the questions well here, because all of a sudden all the things that are ingrained on you, in you from childhood around rejection, the way you're treated, it's all coming up for you. I mean, you're not going, oh, I'm struggling here because of what happened when I was a kid, but there's a lot happening underneath the surface. So I'm also, I know we're about to move into how we deal with that, but I think I just don't want people their head just going straight towards relationships and dating. I think it's important we consider all elements where rejection can play out and can have a really negative impact on something really important. So relationships, job interviews, creative, pitching something creative, whatever it is.
Yeah, absolutely. And it really, it's pervasive across all experiences, and particularly things that are important to us. So, that kind of sensitivity may not show up if it's in an area that's not that important to you. But for example, like when you really want a job, when it's so valued to you and so important, then the anxiety shows up because you care about it.
Yeah.
So, yeah, you're absolutely right, Hugh. This is not specific by any means just to kind of romantic relationships. It's really kind of across the board, and it can, as I said before, I think it can feel really painful to perceive that kind of rejection.
Does rejection sensitivity show up more in certain like you said at the start that rejection sensitivity is not a clinical diagnosis. It's not a but does it show up more in certain in certain people who do, like I'm just thinking like, I don't know, ADHD or OCD or
Yes.
Are there certain It does, yeah.
Yeah, yes, it does. And that's a really good point. So it can be a feature. So feeling really sensitive to rejection can be a feature of a lot of diagnoses, and the ones that kind of really show up there would be things like, I'm not sure if you're familiar with borderline personality disorder. So there's this kind of experience of really strong or overwhelming feelings of rejection in like interpersonal experiences. So there's lots of emotional dysregulation in that kind of presentation. There's a lot of research coming out at the moment about, with respect to neurodiverse populations. So that being sensitive to rejection has shown up as a feature, or can show up as a feature, of ADHD and autism spectrum disorders as well. It can show up in terms of social anxiety. So it can just be kind of a feature. But the main kind of the main or common shared experience across those diagnoses is the emotional pain in response to those perceptions of rejection, and that feels so hard to stay with.
I think that comparing it to social anxiety, or it being like misinterpreted as social anxiety. Social anxiety is a very it's a well used term, and I think probably a lot of people will refer to themselves as having social anxiety, whether they actually probably not diagnosed, but just like, well, I don't like being in public or in social situations, so I must have social anxiety. But it's interesting actually to differentiate it from rejection sensitivity, because maybe, I mean, I guess they're different. Could you explain how they're different, like social anxiety and rejection sensitivity?
Yeah. So first of all, the rejection sensitivity can be more specific to close relationships. So, for example, like I said before, going into romantic partners, close friendships, whereas social anxiety can be that I am anxious going into these social situations of any kind. And I guess we could see social anxiety as it can be like a really global experience. So you walk into any kind of social situation and you get flooded by big physiological changes of fight or flight. It can be very hard to speak. You might notice that you're really hooked into all of those kind of ruminations about, am I saying this okay? What does that person think of me? And so, yes, at the base of that, there's, of course, this avoidance of rejection. But for someone that is sensitive to rejection, they may not be socially anxious. So you might feel fine about meeting new people, but it's the moment where there's a risk to you being rejected that sensitivity shows up. How is that making sense?
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, so much. Yeah, I guess for me, it's like dating, going on a date or having a job interview or pitching an idea. There's extreme vulnerability in that, because the other thing I think about is doing stand-up comedy, for example, like, going out there and to do stand-up comedy, not that I've ever done it, but you walk onto a stage, and by just the simple act of going onto the stage as a stand-up comic, you've promised everyone that you're going to make them laugh. And what you think is funny, they will also think is funny. And so if you don't make them laugh, or you look at their faces and they're not giving you the response you wanted, then you're like, I've failed and I'm not funny, and this is intense rejection. So yeah, I guess it's the difference between like you're putting yourself out there to be judged, and if you're like worried that the judgment is going to be negative, or you perceive the judgment to be negative, then that's personal rejection, or you take it personally, I guess. You can.
Yeah, absolutely. And then that can really lead afterwards to you, for example, ruminating very strongly about how, what went wrong, how that felt to you. And then also then informs how you feel about going into subsequent interactions or subsequent performances, for example. So every experience of perceived rejection kind of really reinforces the need not to be rejected again, which then kind of forms this big feedback loop.
It's kind of like, I don't know how you, I'm only asking Hugh instead of Josh because Hugh, you've done so much public speaking, but like the difference between, for me, doing a podcast in here where there's no audience, it's just us, and Bridge in here, our producer, but there's no audience. Whereas if we were doing this in front of an audience and I went on like one of my insane rants about what I think is wrong with the world or something, and if I was looking into a crowd and I was getting a response, they might be just listening and concentrating. But I often I think I have this rejection sensitivity, because when I see an audience or someone listening, if I perceive them to be not interested, I'll start doubting myself massively. Whereas the benefit of doing a podcast is that like I can't see the response. So
yeah. There's no risk here, I guess.
Yeah,
because
exactly.
we don't see people scrolling through their podcast list and going, I'm not listening to that.
Yeah,
we don't see that.
Yeah. Absolutely. And what that means is, I don't know if you remember in the first episode I did, I talked about how our cognitive capacity declines or deteriorates when we are in threat.
Very well. It really struck a chord with me.
Yeah.
And so this is exactly the same thing, is that, in those moments when we move into that fight or flight response, our capacity to be rational is really impaired. And so then we're acting out of fear or acting out of anger, and that absolutely impairs our performance, whether that be like our our work performance, or whether that be like our interpersonal performance. So, you know, it's a really tricky space to be in.
And it's just so tragic that there's something really tragic about the fact that suffering from it, from this, not that it's a condition, but anxiety or rejection sensitivity confirms the fear that you have. It brings it to life. It's like a real kick in the teeth.
Yeah. Absolutely.
Yeah.
And it's interesting too, because the research really suggests that the experience of social rejection activates the same part in the brain that physical pain is registered. So it's perceived or experienced in the body in the same way that physical pain is when we experience feeling rejected.
Is that what I mean? I'm just sort of thinking about like kids, like when kids are rejected, or, you know, if they feel like they're, you know, they audition for the school play and they don't get it, and and it affects them really badly. They could sometimes, maybe audition's wrong, but yeah, just that rejection, the response can be so visceral. It kind of is the same response as if they fell over and hurt their knee.
Yep.
Is that a fair comparison?
Yeah, that's exactly it. And in fact, one of the things that is the most difficult to work with in the face of rejection is actually the physical sensations. So, I mean, I'm sure you've all had experience of this, of like feeling like so sick in the stomach at the prospect that, for example, this relationship might end, or so sick in the stomach that this performance won't be, you know, viewed well, or, you know, even the thought that a friend is losing contact with you, that the physical sensations that come with that are actually possibly the most unbearable part of that experience.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah.
So what do we do?
Yeah.
Yeah.
I think that's a really, really good question. And
Thanks.
It's also why I really like this. I really loved researching this area because it feels to me as though this is something that's so relevant to all of us in whatever shape or whatever capacity. And also I think that we can actually be quite playful about this. But before we get to that, I think the first thing really is to acknowledge that when we are in a heightened state of arousal, so when we're in that kind of fight or flight mode, it's very difficult for us to be rational, and it's very difficult for us to come up with kind of really reflective responses in those interactions. So one of the first things probably like in those moments is to see as best we can, how do we calm down this nervous system so that we can kind of get that social engagement system back online. And that might be like a number of things. It might be things like really kind of grounding your feet on the floor. So, you know, pushing your feet into the ground, feeling connected to this present moment, kind of like I've done in the past, noticing all of your senses. It can be things like, I think in the last episode I did talked about really naming the story. So it might be like, yep, okay, I can here's my rejection story. I'm noticing here is rejection. So really using that part of you that can observe this experience.
And does it kind of like play into acknowledging what could be the inner parent or that inner voice, the inner critic that you spoke about from last episode?
Yep. Yeah. And I mean, I do have to preface this by saying that this is just one approach. It's the way that I like to work, but it's definitely not the only approach.
How many other people have done a PhD in rejection?
Probably a lot, actually.
Oh, okay.
Thanks, Hugh.
Sorry. So there is like the first thing is that it's really acknowledging that in this moment of perceiving rejection, it's about kind of soothing the nervous system in a way that we can come back online to be really rational about our experiences. But kind of moving out of that, so when we're actually feeling regulated, when we're feeling kind of in this state of like almost homeostasis, is seeing if we actually could be a little bit playful around, you know, what this experience of rejection is about.
Can you explain what homeostasis is very quickly? Sorry.
Yep. So just this state really of the body being in equilibrium. So where we have.
Can you explain what equilibrium?
Sorry.
So it's like just when stuff's normal.
Yeah. Yes. Yep. So I'll just give a very, very quick summary.
Yeah. So it's like just like when stuff's normal and shit. Yeah. Sick.
If we are basing this on polyvagal theory, there are 3 states of the nervous system. The first state is the social engagement state or system, which is where the body is calm, it's got a steady, regular heartbeat, we're able to be curious, our breathing rate is steady, and we're really able to connect and be open to other people. So that's that kind of most evolved part of our autonomic nervous system. And then we've got 2 other systems, which I can talk about another time, but essentially fight or flight or shut down. So the intention is that if once we are back into a state of feeling calm, of feeling able to engage, we can be quite deliberate about working with this sensitivity. And it might be actually about doing some little experiments to really expose us to rejection. And one of the experiments that I really like actually is very simply called the smiling experiment. And it's this idea that, when you walk out down the street or at the shopping centre or maybe down at the local park, is actually just lifting your head and smiling more often at strangers. And just noticing that, you're noticing how that feels and then noticing the responses that you're getting from people. So it's a practice of exposure. And the biggest thing that feeds anxiety is avoidance. So we want to kind of work in the opposite way. So we actually want to expose ourselves to opportunities of rejection, but actually also expose ourselves to opportunities for acceptance.
So it's like it's gathering evidence really, as opposed to avoiding the experiment.
Yes. Yeah. But also just noticing that when we go into an interaction, I'm going to give you an example. This is just a personal anecdote. I have been running a track for the last 10 years. And I used to run along this track with a friend of mine. And at the same time on a Saturday, we would run past a guy who we nicknamed Harry High Pants. And he was...
What sort of pants did he have? High or low?
They were pretty high.
Yep.
And this is a really popular running track, and he would smile and say hello to every person. You could see it. And he was just beaming. And my friend and I used to get really excited when we were like getting closer to Harry High Pants. And it was, again, like this micro moment of positive resonance. And it was this opportunity for experiencing connection and experiencing acceptance. And so for me, that's just an example of where we can seek out those opposite experiences. So where we can seek out real connection with people, so we can notice that I can have these moments of feeling pleasant acceptance. Does that make sense?
Yep.
Yeah.
So is part of it, and I could be wrong here, is part of it if you go for a walk to the park and you smile at everyone and maybe 4 people give you a strange look and kind of reject that, is that you going, oh, I've experienced that and it actually wasn't too bad? Or is it in a job interview later that day you go, well, I've already been rejected 4 times today, so I'm used to this. Is that? I know it sounds silly, but which one is it?
Well, it's actually both. It's actually both. Because if we look at it, the practice is about actually being able to tolerate being rejected.
Yeah, that makes sense, because you get rejected by someone on a walk, but then the next person smiles. So it's kind of not really about you. It's about that person almost a little bit.
Yeah. So if we can actually then reframe it and look at it as seeking moments of rejection. So, for example, you could do things like maybe you're at the supermarket and you get to the end of the checkout and you've forgotten your wallet. That's a moment there of negative evaluation from other people. But knowing that you can, and we can over time, really tolerate and actually be open to the unpleasant feelings that show up when we are rejected.
And another experiment you can do is just submit any self-tape audition to any TV show. You can just do that. That's another way that you can guarantee rejection.
I've been doing this thing.
Yeah, that's very true.
I've been doing this thing, but I don't know what, from your point of view, what this is about. But when I go for a walk with my 2 elder kids, 5.5 and 2.5, whenever a train goes past, I stop and I wave at the train all the way as it goes past. And I know no one's ever once waved to me because everyone's on their phones these days, so no one sees. Or if the odd person do see that, they just don't wave back, which is probably a sad state of affairs. And for some reason, I love making a big deal of that. I go, well, no one waved to me. No one ever waved to me. And I carry on about it for ages. I don't know if it's because I think they think it's funny, or maybe instinctively I'm trying to show them that sometimes people aren't interested in you, or I don't know. I don't know why I do that, but I do it I see a trainer go, yes, I can do this thing where no one waves to me. And I hope no one waves to me. Like, I would like people to wave, but I always think it's a good lesson in there somewhere.
Well, your hypothesis is that no one's going to wave back, and then you're right.
But I don't say to the kids, watch no one will wave. I always go, someone will wave today, surely, and then no one ever does.
Yeah.
Am I trying to show them that, like, I get rejected a lot and that's okay?
Yeah. Yep. I mean, I think that's...
We'll cut this out.
No. I think so. That's just practicing exposure to rejection. And the thing is,
that's like hundreds of people rejecting me every day because there's a lot of people on the train.
Yep. And the thing is that you can then tolerate that. I know that sounds like a trivial, like, kind of answer to that, but you can experience rejection and still be okay. And I think that's kind of in part of this is that if I can drop the avoidance, because avoidance is a really big driver in this dynamic, because what happens is that when you avoid opportunities for rejection, you also avoid opportunities for acceptance.
That's exactly, that's what it is. I didn't realize consciously, but that's what it is. It's like, I want to show them that it's we can all handle being rejected. That's fine.
Yeah.
How weird.
Yeah,
there you
exactly.
go. Do it every day. Never thought about it.
Without like going into a whole nother area of which isn't necessarily what you're talking about, but how much does shame play into this? So it's like, how much could it trigger a shame that if a story, like, to talk about like, acting and auditioning again, it's like if you're carrying around this story and your shame is that your story is that you're not good enough to be chosen by, directors and to be in a show. So then doing an audition, getting rejected again is just feeding the shame. Is that sort of in the same ballpark, or is it sort of a separate thing?
Yeah. Yeah, so shame is certainly a very strong emotional response to rejection, and that's very normal that would happen. And so then I guess the invitation would be to be able to, again, to be open to that feeling of shame. And from a acceptance and commitment therapy approach, it will be working with that feeling and being able to know that to allow that feeling to be here, to work with that in a different way, and to notice that this is that story showing up. But am I still able to, even having that feeling, am I still able to engage with a valued direction? But it's complicated. And I do want to emphasize that, this idea of, doing little behavioral experiments, this is not the whole answer. And I think that for people that have experienced, pervasive rejection and are really sensitive to it, then, that this is, again, kind of longer work, and that would be really well supported by a therapist or, other kind of self-help experience as well. So just knowing that this is not just one answer, that there are lots of different ways to work with this. But again, the biggest one for me is just noticing, like, here is my shame story, or here is my rejection story. It's like, this is it. This is how it's showing up.
A good thing that I've often done in the past is because there's so many stories of well-known people who have had their own form of rejection. Because often when we get rejected, we think that it's like, this is like, I'm the one that's not good enough. Everyone else knows what they're doing. Everyone else will be accepted, but I'm the one that doesn't know what they're doing. It reminds me of there's a couple of good examples of this, but when Ricky Gervais made The Office, the original UK Office, it was on BBC Three. It was aired during the summer. It was this tiny comedy show, and before it went out, someone, I forget which paper, but someone reviewed it, and the headline for the review of The Office before it had gone out, the headline was "A Summer Stinker," and this reviewer wrote up The Office, like reviewed The Office before anyone had seen it, and just tore it to shreds and talked about, like, the lead character is this annoying boss that I just, it's so unbelievable and blah, 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 and wrote this horrible review. I can only imagine if you're Ricky Gervais or Stephen Merchant who's written this show and you're just like terrified, it's like, will people like it? And you read the review in this major newspaper and it's terrible. So anyway, so the show went out and then I think it got played a couple of times and eventually became what it became, like this hugely celebrated thing. That reviewer then wrote a retraction review once it had become popular and said, actually, now I get it. Now I actually like it. I actually like it now. Yeah.
Oh my gosh.
So
wow.
That's something I keep in my back pocket all the time to reference.
Just to go over what you were saying before. So the shame story that showed up for me when I was on this date, when the girl ordered cheesecake, straight away I was like, I'm not good looking enough. And that was in my head the whole time. And I was actually thinking, I want to wind this up quickly, so I don't want to sitting here for an hour thinking he's not good looking enough. And so it was just a terrible date. About a year later, a really good friend of mine told me that he'd actually matched with this girl on Tinder and went on a date with her. And I said, how did it go? And he said it was great. And he said, we were sitting in a bar and then she saw Messina, the ice cream place over the road, and said, I don't want to have a drink. Let's go and have ice cream. And so they went and then I went, oh, that's the same thing she did to me. She didn't want to have a drink. And he went, no, she wanted to have ice cream instead. And I went, yeah, but does that mean she wasn't overly interested? He said, no, it was great. It went really well. The date was amazing. He's a really good looking guy. So I think he didn't see it as rejection. He's just like, yeah, I like ice cream too. We'll go to ice cream instead. But for me, I was like, I'm not good looking. Yeah. She wants to wrap this up by having dessert now. So I wonder if that's like his obviously doesn't get rejected as much as I did.
You misinterpreted the term being deserted.
Possibly.
Does that kind of work?
Possibly. Anyway,
I think that's actually a great example of how the perception of rejection then informs your behaviour and your emotional experience, and the triggering of that shame story too.
Yeah, well, I know this guy very well, and I don't think he gets rejected much by girls, and so he didn't have a shame story attached to that, and he's like, yeah, okay, we'll get ice cream, whatever. This is going to be a great date. I don't really mind what we're doing. Whereas I went, dessert means that's the end of the meal, and so she's trying to wrap this up. Fair enough. I would too. All that kind of stuff, blah, blah, blah. So, maybe just a good example of how like shame stories can interplay with our feelings and experiences of rejection.
Oh, absolutely. They're really kind of intertwined and interlinked, and I think it would be unusual if you didn't feel shame in that moment potentially of feeling rejected or experiencing rejection. There's just one kind of other aspect to this that we could approach, and that is noticing the experience of body language. And interestingly, I have had quite a number of clients who have been socially anxious and or sensitive to rejection, who found that wearing a mask was actually really helpful.
Oh yeah.
And I know this is definitely not the case.
During the pandemic.
Like during COVID, sorry.
Like a Spider-Man mask.
Do you know what I was thinking? Sorry, it's so obvious. Yeah.
And I should say that for a lot of people, actually wearing a mask for COVID was actually anxiety producing. But for some people, the wearing of the mask and everyone else wearing a mask actually really reduced their capacity to be able to pick up on rejection cues in other people's faces. So it's almost like they could walk more easily in the world because they weren't being flooded with perceived cues of rejection.
Wow. That's fascinating.
Which is really interesting.
Yeah.
And so that then kind of brings me then to, well, how can we actually work with our body when we're kind of about to enter a potentially rejecting scenario? So whether that be like an interview or an audition or a date or even a difficult conversation with someone. And that really is around kind of our body being able to tell our mind that I am feeling confident. And so sometimes I even recommend, like before going into a job interview, like doing really expansive work with your body. So beforehand, like being able to stand in the mirror. Actually, I think there might have even been a Ted Lasso episode on this, but like standing with like your arms out and having a really kind of open stance, feeling like your feet connected to the ground, and even just like rolling your shoulders so that you're open. And so this is really kind of telling the body and the mind that I'm open to experience, and can kind of really imbue this kind of sense of confidence. Does that resonate with you?
Yeah. I mean, I can see how that would work. It sort of reminds me of like when I was away and I was doing these episodes remotely. And I don't know if you feel like this, Em, because you're in Perth, obviously doing it over, doing it remotely. it felt quite, not being able to sense both your, like Hugh and Josh, both your body language, it felt quite isolating, like, and probably heightened my feeling of like this rejection sensitivity, because I was like, if I was to jump in, like at the best of times, I start going on a rant like is happening right now, and I'm just, constantly, you can't help but scan for body language to see, like, is this working? Are people enjoying what I'm saying? But when if there's a delay or you don't really feel part of the conversation, it feels like, I feel like my rejection sensitivity goes up because I can't get a sense of your real-time body language and the vibe in the room. Do you ever feel like that, Em, when you're doing these episodes or doing any sort of?
Yeah, look, I much prefer being face-to-face. And actually, having said this, I do a lot of telehealth in my private practice. But I would, in an ideal world, it would be so great if we could all be in person, because I think we can lose, first of all, we can lose the kind of the interaction between our nervous systems. And I don't mean for that to sound like woo-woo, but we are so usually in tune with another person's nervous system when we're face-to-face that it's almost like that I can feel if you're anxious or I can feel if you're feeling happy, and our nervous systems really interact with each other. Being non-face-to-face can be more challenging, I think, and for some of us can like trigger more anxiety about that particular interaction.
So can I just go back to the last activity you spoke about? You said standing in the mirror, stretching your arms out. Is it so? It's creating like so you're experimenting different, like making yourself feel bigger, or are you sort of just, is it just movement that gets you going so that when you sit in an interview, you're feeling more confident, or?
Yeah. Look, it's actually kind of both of those things. So if you think about, if you are feeling fearful, often our natural tendency is to kind of crouch or to shrink in some ways.
Yeah.
Be small, yeah. And so these kind of exercises are around like actually opening up the body, taking up space and allowing the body to feel as though I've got some kind of confidence here. The other aspect to that is also this movement. So being able to kind of feel a sense of strength in the body, to be able to be moving, I think can be really helpful for managing that feeling of fear and that fear of being rejected.
It works because Em, you've seen me do my like talk, and Ryan, you saw it at Hamer Hall, but and Josh, you've I didn't need to say it also. And Josh, you've seen it many times, but I open my show with a story about when I met your best mate, Ryan Hamish Blake, and it's a very physical story. It requires me to walk a lot up and down the stage and to move my arms a lot, and I have to crouch down at one point. I have to do all these things, and it gets me. A couple of times I've not told the story. And the difference in my performance, I already knew that was because of that physical element. Like when I act out, and it's quite a big acting performance.
It's a very physical thing.
It's a very physical experience for me. It sets up the rest. I feel so confident after that, and it's a little bit because people laugh at it, but also I just know because I've stood up in front of lots of people, and I've moved a lot of movement, and been very physical, and it gets me into space where I feel really confident. So I know firsthand how powerful that is.
When
absolutely.
In my first job, I used to work in retail, and the company I worked for, they had all these, because it was quite a sizable company, and they had lots of different stores, and so often you'd get like directives down from head office to say like, from now on all staff do this, or these are the 10 steps to a sale, or whatever it might be. But one of the things that happened for a few years was at the start of every shift, we had to do what they called a power stance. So in the back room, we genuinely had to do this. We couldn't not do it. We had to get to work, and then out in the back room, which was not like soundproofed or anything, in the back room, we literally had to stand and throw our arms out to the side like a big kind of star, and our legs, and scream as loud as we could. as a like energy producing movement that we then bounce out onto the floor and sell some belts. But the weirdest, and maybe it did work, but the strangest thing was there'd be customers like shopping, and all of a sudden they just hear, "Ah!" Oh, Troy's here.
It's amazing.
That is excellent. So there is some research actually, and I don't know all the specifics of this, but I can send some through. That they compared different forms of exercise in terms of kind of self-reassurance. And they had 3 conditions. They had someone that was sitting on a stationary bike and not doing anything, so just sitting. They had groups of people that were sitting on those lay back bikes where you just kind of like laying back. Yep, those ones. I'm doing this as though people can see me. Or then they have like the spin bikes where people are up out of the saddle and they're doing that movement. Mm-hmm. And what they did was they compared basically experiences of self-assurance, and they found that the people that were out of the saddle, that were moving forward, that were in this kind of like literal moving forward motion, were far more self-assured than the ones that were sitting back doing nothing. I think that's just like really fascinating, kind of really telling information about how the body informs the state of the mind.
Yeah. Wow.
Yeah, we've got an exercise bike in our garage, and I use it at night because of just with the kids. And I often walk out after it, and Penny's on the couch watching television, and I feel very confident, and I feel like going, this is a waste of feeling confident. I don't want to feel confident here. I need to feel confident like when I'm doing talks, not when I'm just hanging out with Penny trying to watch TV. Anyway, can cut that bit out. But, it's a terrible example.
The one question I wanted to ask was, in a situation, in any sort of conversation, whether it be a date or a job interview or a pitch or any sort of interaction, is there something that you can do as the person, as the listener? So being on the other side of it. So, for example, if you're not the one being interviewed, if you're the interviewer, is there anything that we can do if we've listened to this episode and think like, I want to try and make things easier and reduce other people's rejection sensitivity?
Or on a date as well.
Or on a date,
even if you know you are going to reject them, like just early, but just so you want them to give them a chance to be their best self and not shrink up. Yeah.
It's like, I guess it's like being a good listener or being I don't know. Yeah.
And so, that absolutely, as that listener, and I'm not sure if you guys find this when you're, like Hugh in particular, if you're doing public talks, is that if you can find the person that's giving you those non-verbal cues, so like as an interviewer, being able to like physically lean in and to be able to nod your head and to be smiling. So they're really pro-social cues and allowing that person to notice that I'm feeling like a moment of like, again, this kind of positive moment of I actually can't even say whatever the word is, a moment of feeling connected.
Yes.
So those things, like as a listener, being able to display curiosity, whether that be through like a smiling face or a nodding face or just the physical leaning in.
Yep.
And as someone that is being interviewed, if there is a panel, always searching for the one that's doing that, because there usually will be one. Or if you're doing public speaking, finding the one that is giving you the nodding or giving you that kind of engagement.
That's great.
Yeah,
great advice.
So I thought I would just finish with this quote that I find really important and really resonates with me. And it's by Ron Siegel, who is from Harvard Medical School. And he says that it is about making a connection and not an impression.
Really good.
Yeah.
Oh,
really
great.
good.
Yeah.
So when you're sitting there with someone, it's not trying to impress them. It's not trying to make them think, gosh, this person's amazing, whether on a date or whether in a job interview. It's just, I want to connect with this person.
Yeah. Yeah. And how do we connect with people?
Nod, smile.
So
I thought that was like a quiz.
Yes.
You were very quick to answer. Someone wanted to be the star student.
Correct.
Nod, smile.
Lean forward. Did I win?
Yeah, definitely won the first prize. No, yeah, all those things plus asking questions. So like even if there's just one thing that you can do if you're going into an anxiety-provoking situation is asking questions of the other person. So really moving towards this kind of curiosity about the other person. And that is about connection rather than making this impression.
Interested, not interesting.
Yes, exactly.
I just realised that the word impress, I wonder if that's from impression. To impress someone is making an impression. I've
sure
never
it
thought
is.
about that.
Yeah.
Interesting.
Mm-hmm.
Well, Dr. Emily, another cracker. God, that was great. Thank you so much.
Yeah, I'm going to think about this one a
it's a
lot over
pleasure.
the next little while.
Yeah. And particularly that final, that making a connection, not an impression, is really great. For me, at least.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I love that.
Mm-hmm.
You're amazing, Em. Thank you so much.
Oh, thank you. Thanks for having me.
We're so
Good to see
lucky.
you
Our
all.
listeners are so lucky. Yeah, you're amazing.
And
That's very kind.
and there's one more Dr. M after this for the year.
Oh, only one
You'll be
more.
back next year. I mean, more next year, but
Well, we haven't asked
Oh, that's
if she wants to
exciting.
yet, but if we would like you to be back next year, definitely.
I would love to come back. That would be great.
great verbal contract. Thanks, Em. We'll see you next time.
See you soon.
Bye, Em.
See you
Bye.
soon.
Thanks, Em.
Bye.
If this episode has been triggering for you, we strongly recommend Lifeline on 131114. The Imperfects is hosted and co-produced by Hugh Van Cuylenberg, Ryan Shelton and Josh Van Cuylenberg. This episode was produced by Bridget Northeast, edited by Jamison Moore, filmed by Andy Poole and social mediaed by George Martin. A special thanks to Dr. M for her expertise and guidance. We'd also like to thank the Resilience Project for their ongoing support.